socialists, Republicans, and now the far right. Which one do you think might have the chance of winning for the next round, which the result will come out over the weekend? Ms. Moutet.
We don't know, because we have a system whereby if you have three people running in the same election, then the Front National will have a plurality and win. But that's something that the government has regretfully tried to stem by asking their, and sometimes forcing their candidates, the socialists who came in third, from stepping down. In North and in Provence, the two areas where the two Front National leaders, Marion and Marine Le Pen, have scored most, the situation is such that the socialists stepped down. They knew they had no chance. In the East, where the number 2 of the Front National is running, the socialist has said that he did not want to step down. The Prime Minister had told him that he should, and the situation is stuck as is right now. It's going to be an interesting configuration.
What does it really mean? The far right is gaining so much political ground, particularly after the Paris attack. Is the politics inside France going to a very different direction?
Well, thank you very much. That's a great question. I think it's important also to look at the personalities and the fact that the biggest scores that the Front National has been making in the three sort of biggest regions have to do with the political leadership of the party. The other participants and other candidates haven't done that well. The highest scores, about 40%, close or over, have been done by the leader of the party, Marine Le Pen, the number 2 of the party, and the number 3 of the party, actually also Le Pen. And that matters a lot. It's hard to say if the attacks have had a direct impact on the vote. It has confirmed to those who actually wanted to vote for the Front National that definitely. You do see that in Paris, on the other hand, this has had no impact at all on how people have voted, and still the Socialist Party and the Republicans are the ones in the lead. So it's hard to say if that's a national sweep or not. It'll be very interesting to see the results on Sunday to get a better sense in terms of number of votes, what actually is the state of the Front National. But indeed, it's hard today to deny the fact that there are three political forces.
Professor Maxwell, from your perspective, studying ethnic and also religious minorities inside Western European countries for long, what do you think, how representative is going to be the French politics this time, reflected as with the fierce competition we see among the three parties, particularly the rise of the far right?
That is a good question. I know people all over Europe are waiting to see what will happen, and in part to see what it might mean for their countries. I think we're entering a situation where there is somewhat of a perfect storm in increasing support for the far right. Already we saw this before the Paris attacks, when the refugee crisis was emerging this summer and fall, in part because we know that a dramatic increase in immigrants is what gets people very excited. Less so the overall percentage, but the dramatic increase. And the refugee crisis clearly was that. In addition, when something is very salient in the national media, which was also clearly the case. So therefore, people who may not even see refugees or even see immigrants are watching this on their televisions every day, and that's fueling all sorts of underlying tensions that also existed because of the economy. So it's really a perfect storm, and the Paris attacks only added to that, and we can only hope that nothing further will happen, but it's really a perfect storm for the far right.
Is there anything, Professor Maxwell, since you are coming from the US, that you can draw upon by doing comparison, what is going on right now inside Europe, particularly the country of France, and also the United States after 9/11. I mean, both after terrorist attack, you see politics becoming more internal. You also see borders are not likely to be more open than they used to be. You see people seem to try to hold on to one another in order to get some warmth and to seek a future. How is this French politics this time different from the American experience? After all, after so many years of September 11th, there were a lot of soul searching about what happened then and how people should better react to what happened then. Professor Maxwell?
Yes, there has been a lot of soul searching. I think one of the biggest differences between the United States and Western Europe that is often mentioned is the different composition of the Muslim population.
That's right.
So as many people know, in the United States, the Muslim population is much smaller, tends to be better educated, and did not come from the same complicated guest worker, former colonial heritage that we see in Europe. So the Muslim population in Europe is much more complicated. It's perhaps a better analog to the Latino migration in the US combined with the African American former slave population. And so the complicated links there that can lead to all sorts of potential tension are really very complicated and have many implications, and makes it perhaps much more difficult to deal with, because even if you deal with ISIS and even if you acknowledge the fact that most Muslims in Europe are peaceful and like where they live in Europe, they feel European, they don't feel attached to their home countries, there's going to be a minority, a tiny minority of alienated people who are going to be, it's a very difficult situation.
Right, and that on that point, I really want to go back to Ms. Moutet. What do you make of it? I mean, as Professor Maxwell already did some very interesting comparison, population, demographic-wise, but for Europe, particularly France, an emphasis on secular state has been done once and again by politicians. And yet we all know the immigrants coming into France and some of the other European countries has already changed the proportion of population to quite some degree. So when politics emphasizing on so-called anti-immigration, anti-Islam, what would eventually that mean for the electorate? That would be a very interesting question. Ms. Moutet, what do you make of this point?
What's obvious is that you've got a third generation population of people who've been born in France, whose parents were born in France, and they feel more alienated than their parents and their grandparents who are on their way to integrate pretty well. So we are talking about actually something a bit different. We have the combination of the effects of globalization and the fact that if you have not a very good education, it's more and more difficult to find a job in a country where the system is so rigid that creating jobs for non-specialist workers is almost impossible. So that's one case of discontent. That's the first one. The second is that we've had waves of immigration in France. France is very comparable to the United States in many ways. We have been for centuries a country of immigration, and it starts with Julius Caesar and it never stops. So 1 out of 3 French people can trace directly an ancestor who comes from a foreign country. Some of the best known names in French culture are foreigners. So if you take Yves Montand, the singer, he's Italian, etc. So it's not something that used to be a problem. You know, Nobel Prize, double Nobel Prize Marie Curie was a Pole. Again, we used to be a country that used to assimilate people very well. There's a feeling from the Front National voters that until now, the French assimilation system, which is a very universalist system in which you come, you sign into the Republic values, you sign into this, you become completely French, you don't become French hyphenated something, and that all those nations played the game, and there's a feeling that possibly because of the difference in today's world, because of television, because of the internet, because of cheap flights, it's easier to keep your roots somewhere else and to come to France and to not sign into the French ethos and the French nationality.
That's exactly the debate, isn't it? I mean, Mr. Xavier-Bender, that France is a secular state, but at the same time, it's not just about foreign immigrants. It's about immigrants who are coming from a very different religious background. And that makes things quite different, as Professor Maxwell just mentioned, compare, let's just say, to the United States. So secular state vis-a-vis a huge Islamic population coming into this country over the past few decades. What do you make of it in terms of its impact on the local politics?
Well, two points to your question. First of all, the secular state is something that is a very very in the heart of the French people, and since 1905, separation of state and church is going to remain, and there are every decade a conversation about that, but it'll stay. What is interesting this time, and maybe also to the difference with the former waves of immigration in France, it is that the people coming in actually can't find jobs. And that is a different relationship than in before, where people were coming in actually because we needed them. So the fact that we're seeing a flux of migrants, and actually I wouldn't say there's a huge flux of Muslim migrants towards France. There are more migrants and there is more immigration, but it is how do you adapt your own system to this new reality where actually people are coming in, and often in areas where there's nothing that they can actually contribute to directly. And that makes it very local. And that's why it's important to remember that in local elections, any discourse that is anti-migrant is very popular. At the national level, it's a different story. It still remains to be seen if that is something that actually allows you to win national elections. Because the French are very, and I agree with that statement, very keen on keeping the values of the Republic as sort of the guiding principle.
But may I just follow up a little bit, Mr. Xavier-Bender? You have just said that this is the only difference, and probably the biggest difference, that the people now coming in as immigrants do not find jobs, yet they're, the last generation probably, they have very suitable positions for themselves when they come into France. So what would that mean? On the other hand, what would that mean for the other European countries? Because there seems to be so-called old Europe, using the American politicians' words, are facing in exactly similar challenges, Mr. Xavier-Bender.
They are, and everyone is seeing the limit of the system they've designed, and we see it in Germany, we see it in Sweden, we've seen it in the UK. Everyone has designed a system that seemed to the politicians to work for the past 10, 20 years, but it doesn't work to the current reality. And we're seeing tensions in every country when it comes to integration of communities that have already been there for a while, or new communities coming in. And that is probably the reality check in this year and then in coming years, and why it's important that there's a European-wide response to this, which is how do we adapt our system to the economic crisis, to the refugee crisis, and now to the security crisis. And it's that combination of three crises that makes it even more complex today than before.
Professor Maxwell, what do you make of that three crises all in one, as Mr. Xavier-Bender mentioned? And were there any so-called experiences and lessons can be learned about quote-unquote successful assimilation when you have such a traumatic challenge right in front of those Western European countries? Professor Maxwell.
Well, I agree that there are many crises at the moment, but I do think we want to take a little bit of historical perspective and remember that the immigration from the early 20th century was difficult at the time, and in part that there are tensions now because our standards have risen, but people were beating Italians in the street in Paris, and they were not happy about immigrants 100 years ago either. So the economic issue is clearly one, but the other issue that people like myself study is the extent to which, even when the new immigrants have jobs, are they going to be held back by their visible differences, which is their skin color and potentially their religion if they're displaying it in public. And so this is also an issue that we have in the United States. The debate is whether or not this new immigrant community will follow in the steps of the assimilation that happened for Italians and Southern Europeans in France over time or not. And that remains to be seen, and will probably go a little bit past our current economic cycle.
Ms. Moutet, French politics is always a very interesting symbol for some of the other European countries, shall I say. So what do you think might be the impact of this debate going on inside France, first of all, and the possible impact on the final election results have on the other capitals who are looking at Paris very closely at this moment?
I think it's huge, and I think we've only talked about immigration, but immigration is not the only reason why the Le Pens have made such inroads. We have two separate problems. One have got to do with the fact that increasingly, not just in Europe, but in America, and we see this with the Trump candidacy, a large swathe of the voters feel that they are not being listened to. and are being despised by elites who are out of touch at the top, and that is an impression that you also have in other countries. And the other thing is that the other question is the European Union and this brief that's in the treaty of ever closer union, and more you get reactions of people who say, again, this is not democratic. These are, again, elites imposing stuff from up, top down, without wanting to listen to us, but they are not even French. And we look at Denmark and we see reactions in politics in Denmark that show a change. We see that Britain first mooted the idea of a referendum to get out of the EU, and it was seen as a thunderbolt in a clear sky. But now the British say, you see, we were right all along. We see movements in Italy, we see movements in Spain, we see in Eastern Europe, and so the consequences are much wider, and they all tell politicians, look, you keep repeating